He had one choice: write the enemy's name or hide it to save his life. 1944, Ardennes, Belgium. A gale pushes snow against the canvas. Lantern light trembles, throwing ragged shadows across rows of stretchers. Breath fogs in the cold air, clinking of a metal canteen, the soft thud of boots when another litter comes in. A young German lies with his uniform singed at the shoulder. A folded scrap of paper peeks from his pocket. Dr. Edward Carter kneels, one gloved hand steady on the man's wrist, the other closing around a worn field diary, pages damp and stained with ink and coffee. Nearby, an ampule clicks under a nurse's fingers as she prepares morphine. He's the enemy. He's a patient. Edward slides open the diary, the pen in his hand catching the lantern's glare, numbers scratched on the margin, the next line blank, and the pen hovers above the page. His thumb presses the corner of the page, the ink beads on the nib. Helen's eyes catch his, a small private alarm, and her hand tightens on the ampule as if she might crush it. The German's breath rasps, a rhythm too thin to trust. Outside, artillery mutters like a far wail. Snow hisses against the tent fabric. Edward feels the weight of the diary, the address folded inside like a petition. He breathes through his scarf, counts the slow ticks of the silver watch against his palm, and brings the pen down toward the page just as the canvas at the tent mouth snaps. Mercy where hate was expected. In the thin light of the field hospital, orders and oaths collide. A bullet does not know a uniform, and a pulse is a pulse. Dr. Edward Carter stands with a pen over a blank line, the diary trembling in his gloved hand while distant shells punctuate the night. Stretchers form a tight city of breaths and bandages. A clipboard tapping at the tent mouth sounds like a summons. Around him, nurses move with the steady economy of people who have learned to keep judgment out of a syringe. The choice before him is small and absolute. Inscribe a name or protect it under the word unknown, and in that quiet decision, the meaning of duty is tested. If stories of courage under oath move you, consider subscribing. The Ardennes in December of 1944 is not a backdrop so much as a pressure. This aid station sits a few miles behind the front, a battalion's field hospital pressed into a cluster of torn trees and snowbound mud. Dr. Edward Carter serves as the battalion surgeon, a physician attached to the aid station. Helen Brooks is the senior nurse, moving like a clock, reading pulse and panic in the same glance. Their tent holds what will fit: stretchers, a folding table for triage, tins of morphine, rolls of bandage, a crate of ampules with labels gone soft from damp. Red Cross markings make the canvas visible from a distance, but they do not stop shelling or the cold or the long nights when surrendering men and friendly wounded arrive together. Orders from command are plain and often repeated. Prioritize your own. Conserve blood, morphine, warmth. The paperwork at the tent mouth will ask for names, units, and origins. A clerk's signature can send a man forward to transfer or backward to interrogation. Yet international law, the Geneva Convention, still stands as a thin promise. Medical personnel are to treat the wounded without hostile discrimination. In practice, that promise runs up against supply lists, the suspicion of comrades, and the real danger of reprisal if a medic is seen to favor an enemy soldier. Here the practiced ritual of triage is also a moral test. A dying man is a patient first and last, but choosing to save him can mean bending orders and risking consequences. In those moments, the station's quiet ethic tightens into a single, simple claim: oath over orders, mercy over propaganda. A litter thuds into the tent, snow spattering the canvas like cold ink. Men bend and call names, breath sharp and quick. The newcomer is half buried in a smoky coat, his sleeve singed, a strip of cloth tied raggedly around his chest. Edward feels the tilt of the stretcher under his palms before he looks at the face. Young, eyes shuttered, lips blue-lipped with cold. A folded scrap of paper presses against the man's breast pocket. A mud-streaked armband dangles from a wrist, not his own. "How many?" Helen asks. "One more," the litter-bearer says. "Looks German." "We can't," a corporal starts. "He'll die if we wait," Edward interrupts, voice low as the lantern. They strip away the outer layer with careful hands, revealing burns and a shallow, desperate rise in the chest. Edward counts pulses, listens for breath at the ribs, the way an experienced medic marks time. He nods to Helen. She tightens a bandage roll and tears gauze with quick, practiced fingers. The diary is tucked under Edward's elbow. The scrap of paper slips free. For a moment, he stares at the address, then tucks the letter back into the seam so no one else will see it. The first moments of care in a field hospital are triage in its most literal sense. A rapid segregation of survivable from unsalvageable, treatable from deferred. The protocol requires speed, stop bleeding, secure airways, restore circulation. But the protocol also assumes a neutral moral ground. In practice, medics worked within a pressure chamber of orders and scarcity. A decision to move a man ahead of the queue is not only clinical, it is political and personal. The presence of enemy uniform or language could turn a clinical priority into a disciplinary problem. In the tent that night, the instrument of triage sat beside oath and suspicion. The physical act of saving became entwined with a choice about whom to recognize as a human being worthy of that effort. The triage table is a wooden plank balanced on crates, a map of bandage rolls and blood-stained hands. A clipboard sits at its end where a clerk tries to keep up with names and units as if ink could stop incoming shells. Edward lays the young German flat and probes for entry wounds. No obvious fracture, but the breath is shallow, and one side of the chest is dull under the stethoscope. Helen holds the ampule of morphine like a precious thing between thumb and forefinger. "Category 2, she calls, marking the cloth with a chalky cross. "Stable enough to move after we secure the chest." "A delay could mean collapse," Edward says, and the words feel like an order to himself. "Command wanted priority for our line," the clerk says without looking up. Edward meets his gaze for a heartbeat, then turns back to the patient, fingers steady despite the cold. He marks the diary with a stray line as if to anchor the moment. Triage is both a clinical algorithm and a moral ledger. In large hospitals, triage followed a structured scale. In a battalion aid station, that scale was compressed and subjective. The categories, immediate, delayed, minimal, expectant, are designed to maximize lives saved with available resources. But when the resources themselves, blood, morphine, warmth, are rationed, and when the social system insists certain lives rank higher, the medic's role shifts from algorithm to arbiter. Choosing who receives immediate intervention is a medical decision with ethical consequences. It decides who has a chance to reach further care, who might be sent to interrogation, who might be left to die. For Edward, each mark on the linen was a small rebellion against a ledger that would otherwise tally soldiers by flag rather than by heartbeat. The tent narrows into a surgical theater. Lantern light pools on a folding tray where a scalpel, a length of tubing, and a small, dull field knife wait. Edward speaks with a voice that has practiced clarity. "Scalpel," he says. "Clamp." Helen steadies the patient, breath coming in ragged waves. The chest on one side is soft and hollow. The sound is wrong. Edward chooses a place between ribs, wipes the line with alcohol from a tin, and makes a controlled incision. The motion is precise and quiet. Even under fire, a practiced hand can be methodical. He slips a length of tubing into the wound, attaching it to a makeshift suction setup fashioned from a canteen and a length of canvas. The tubing pulls at a dark, thin film of fluid and air. The chest re-expands in a breath that looks like stunned relief. "Hold him steady," Helen murmurs. "Steady. You're doing good," Edward tells the German in English and then softer in fractured German that he knows from a phrase book. The man's eyelids flutter. The procedure Edward performs is a basic thoracostomy, an incision to evacuate air or fluid from the chest cavity that is compressing the lung. In theater, medics often had to improvise tools when standard kits were damaged or absent. A canteen could become a suction reservoir. A strip of tubing could stand in for sterile drains. The clinical aim is simple: re-establish ventilation. The moral aim is heavier. To cut into an enemy soldier's chest is to cross a symbolic line in the sight of battle. It is to treat a man who, in the mind of some comrades, represents the abstract enemy. The acts of medicine and of mercy coincide, and in that overlap lies risk. The risk of accusation, the risk of being labeled soft, the risk of practical consequences for scarce supplies diverted to those deemed less deserving. Night deepens and the supply crate is light. The ampules in their box rattle like dice. The sarge nearby mutters in his sleep, fever burning under blankets. A young private needs a transfusion. The blood bank is miles away and the radio line is dead. Helen caps an ampule with a practiced flick. "We've got 3 left," she says, voice thin. "Give to the man in 2, the corporal says. "Sarge is a priority." "He'll be needed at the front," another voice adds, half argument, half fear. Edward measures the light on the German's face. The morphine would ease pain and blunt shock, and in a small window of hours, it might keep him stable enough for evacuation. He feels the weight of every dose as though it were a coin with a history. "Give him one," Edward decides. "Now." Helen hands over the ampule, fingers trembling. She looks at him with an expression that mixes admiration and dread. "This could come down on you," she says. "I know," he answers. He breathes. Morphine was both a tool of comfort and a strategic resource. Medics rationed analgesia with clinical and tactical considerations in mind. A soldier who would return to fighting could not be kept overly sedated, and scarce doses were often prioritized for those whose survival made tactical sense. Administering morphine to an enemy soldier was not merely a pharmacological act. It was a moral claim on medical neutrality. The Geneva Convention called for non-discriminatory care, but the reality was that scarcity created a calculus in which mercy could contradict strategy. The choice to allocate relief was an assertion of the medic's oath, the alleviation of suffering irrespective of uniform. Dawn brings a clipboard and a man in a pressed wool coat whose boots leave defined prints in the tent mud. He carries the formal, brisk manner of supply line officers. Papers flutter when he speaks. "We need rosters." "Names, units, statuses," he says, tapping each line like a metronome. Edward wipes his hands on a bandage roll and approaches with the diary, pages flapped by wind and use. The officer's eyes slide toward the German on the cot with cool disinterest. "We can only officially record our own," the officer says. "Command orders. Prioritize our wounded. Any enemy found gets turned over." Edward feels something tighten under his ribs. He thinks of the folded scrap of paper, the address that might mean someone's mother still alive in a small town somewhere. He slides the diary open and reads the line he has been weighing. "Unknown," he writes, in careful block letters, placing a protective blank where a name should be. He folds the letter into the diary between pages, hiding it from sight. "This could cost you?" Helen whispers. The officer clears his throat, eyebrows raised. "Make sure your reports match," he says, less a question than an instruction. He stamps a rubber seal on a page and moves on. Administrative paperwork in war has a direct and often brutal force. A name on a roster determines whether a man is evacuated, interrogated, repatriated, or left behind. Recording an enemy as unknown could protect him from immediate reprisal or from transfer to detention, but it could also create suspicion. Military bureaucracy is unforgiving. Deviations from protocol invite inquiry. Yet the diary, as a physical object, also served as a moral ledger. Medics kept field notes that were clinical, personal, and at times protective. To write unknown was to make a deliberate intervention in the archival record, a small act of concealment that shelved a man's identity under a neutral term and, by extension, offered him a fragile shield. Days pass in a rhythm that is at once monotony and urgency. The station cleans bandages, rinses cups, and reads names aloud. The German stirs more now, lips moving around a whisper. Edward sits by the cot long after others have gone to sleep, the diary open on his knees. The folded address peeks at him like a private obligation. "What's your name?" he asks one afternoon, keeping his voice level. The man twists his head and tries, syllables like broken glass. "Matthias," he manages at last, slurred and slow. Edward presses a finger to his lips and then to the diary. He opens it to the line where unknown is written. For a long breath, the two men look at the book that holds both an erasure and a protection. "If I write it down," Edward says quietly, "it might go where they send names." He thumbs the folded letter back into the seam. Matthias tries to speak again and then closes his eyes. Helen comes in with a cup of broth and sets it to the man's lips. He takes it, tentative, and the warmth slides down like a small promise. Small acts of withholding can be acts of mercy. In a military context, the act of naming someone is procedural, but also determinative. To remove a name from a report is to suspend the bureaucratic machinery that would otherwise commandeer a man's fate. That suspension is a gamble. It places discretion over the inertia of paperwork, and, in doing so, subjects the medic to potential charges of insubordination. Yet for those who take an oath to preserve life, sometimes the only way to keep that oath is to obscure it from the bureaucratic eye. The diary becomes a quiet juridical instrument, a place where mercy can be written in pencil and saved from the stamp of officialdom. Rumors arrive like sleet. A patrol found a field hospital that had sheltered enemy wounded. Men were questioned. A lieutenant, new and watchful, lingers at the tent edge with a stack of forms. He reads the roster aloud in the crisp way people read who expect others to answer. "Any of our men missing?" he asks. "Any prisoners processed?" "No," Helen answers. Her face is pale but composed. Edward watches the lieutenant fold the forms and look toward the cot where Matthias sleeps with a bandaged chest. For a moment, the world narrows to the distance between two people and the possibility of being found out. "You know the rules," the lieutenant says, voice like a shutter. "If it comes down on you." He writes something on the clipboard and walks away. Edward dips the pen in the ink once more, not to register a name, but to underline the word unknown, as if giving it weight. He thinks of his father's watch in his pocket and of a vow he whispered before he ever saw combat: to do no harm, to bind wounds without favor. The pen scratches, and the ink soaks the paper. Military culture often understands obedience as the backbone of survival. Medics, however, operate at an uneasy intersection between obedience and moral autonomy. The threat of reprisal, from formal court-martial to simple ostracism, was real and could be leveraged to enforce compliance. Yet medics whose professional identity is anchored in an oath to care found themselves improvising ethics in the field. Under the pressure of command, some chose to comply outwardly while safeguarding inwardly. The act of underlining unknown is both a paperwork maneuver and an ethical seal, a way to protect life by folding it into the unremarkable, the administratively neutral, the anonymous. Supply trucks come and go, the tensor bandage rolls get thinner, soap gets traded for cigarettes. Through it all, the station hums like a small, stubborn community whose laws are the measured ones of medicine. Men exchange small mercies. A warm canteen passed across a stretcher, a slice of bread shared, a letter read aloud in a whisper. The diary sits on a shelf, its pages slightly ruffled, an artifact of attention more than of record. One morning, an order arrives. The aid station will be evacuated and set up further to the rear. Wounded will be processed, lists compiled, and transport prioritized. Edward looks at Matthias, who now can raise his hand and brush the hair from his forehead. The man reaches toward the diary and, with a slow, careful movement, fingers the seam where the address is hidden. "Will I?" Matthias tries to ask. Edward closes the diary for a moment, feeling the weight of ink and decision. He could read the name aloud, put it into the roster, and risk the mechanisms of war to take their course. He could fold the paper back in and walk away with a protected secrecy. He could hand the diary over and trust a system that had not yet earned that trust. He slips the diary into his pocket, not yet papering the ledger with the name. He steadies Matthias with a quiet hand on the shoulder. "You rest," he says. "When the war ends, someone needs to find their way back home." Evacuation procedures are moments of institutional vulnerability and moral testing. To transfer a patient is to place him into a chain of custody that may be clinical, legal, or punitive. Medics had to weigh the likelihood of survival against the certainty of bureaucracy. Concealment was an active choice against an apparatus that often treated people as data points. The diary again functions as both a shield and a record of choice. Its concealment is an ethic of care that resists a system that would otherwise subsume the individual under the needs of the many. Later, under the roar of engines and the smell of diesel, Matthias wakes and finds the diary in Edward's pocket. He slides a hand inside and feels the folded paper. He touches the outer edge where unknown is written, and then looks up at Edward with eyes that are less confused than questioning. "Why?" he asks in halting English. Edward looks at the man who had come with a singed sleeve and a paper scrap in his pocket. The field diary is heavy with small notations, dosages, times, a loose stroke that marks the night of the storm. Edward answers with a line that is not a justification but a confession. "Because some things are not for war to decide," he says. The final exchanges between those saved and those who saved are the ethical aftercare of battlefield medicine. Questions of why are rarely answered with clean logic. They are answered with acts, with documentation choices, with the quiet folding of a paper to conceal a name. In that quiet, the medic asserts a principle, that within war's machinery there remain pockets of humanity where one may choose restraint. To shelter a name is to assert that civilization need not be extinguished by conflict. It is a small claim that the medical oath can stand as a counterweight to other demands. Across the week before evacuation, the station accumulates small testimonies. A boot polished and left beside a cot, a razor-sharp phrase exchanged between brothers in arms, a canteen offered to a trembling hand. Edward watches men find their own small reconciliations. A cigarette smoked in silence by two former enemies who no longer care which side the smoke came from. He notes the ampule box now lighter, the bandage rolls half as thick, the diary thicker with pencil marks that mean both record and refuge. When the time comes to load stretchers onto the truck, the orderly asks for names to be read aloud. Edward holds the diary for a moment, thumb on the crease where unknown is written. He looks at Matthias, whose gaze is steady and filled with a precarious, grateful clarity. "What name do you want?" Edward asks. Matthias searches his mind for a name that will survive the logistics of war. He touches his chest as if to find it there. "Matthias," he says finally. Edward nods and keeps the line blank. Unknown stands. He wraps a bandage roll snug around Matthias's arm and helps lift him onto the stretcher. The diary slips back into his pocket like a heartbeat kept under the ribs. The final decisions at evacuation show the tension between official reporting and personal protection. Naming someone can root them into legal processes that may be dangerous. Leaving them unknown can be a kind of mercy that preserves possibility. For medics such as Edward, the choice to withhold a name is not an evasion of responsibility, but an enactment of it. a choice to prioritize life and the conditions for its continuation over rigid adherence to forms that may produce harm. In these small acts, the medic's oath is not merely a pledge but a practical compass, guiding restraint and compassion. The station moves on. Trucks roll, tents collapse into wet canvas, and the diary travels in a pocket warmed by human touch. The imprint of unknown is a faint ridge on the page, a record of what was withheld. In the spaces left blank, lives continue to hang between danger and hope. Edward watches the line of stretchers vanish into the gray. He knows there will be questions later, possibly inquiries that will test his choices. He also knows the immediate truth in his hands. A man who might otherwise have died is breathing. For a moment, he allows himself the small private satisfaction that some duty has been kept. Not the duty of orders, but the older duty he learned in training and in a quiet promise to himself, to treat the wounded according to need, not banner. Field medicine often requires medics to choose between rules and compassion. Those choices can carry personal risk, but are grounded in the professional oath to relieve suffering. In theaters of war, where policy and propaganda press on one side and suffering on the other, acts like withholding a name, allocating scarce medicine, or improvising a procedure become moral statements. They say that even under fire, it is possible to place humanity above hostility. The diary, scratched, folded, and carried close, becomes a small testament to that ethic, a record of restraint, a refusal to let paper determine a man's fate. The evacuation order turns the tent into a funnel of movement and noise. Men tighten wraps, strap boots, voices clip to save breath. Engines thrum in the distance, a steady undercurrent beneath the scraping of canvas and the clink of metal stretchers. A convoy sergeant arrives with military police in tow. His breath fogs as he reads the rosters aloud, his finger following each line like a small hammer. He pauses at the cot where Matthias lies propped on pillows, the bandage at his chest clean, the shallow edge of his breath steadier than it was a week before. "That's an enemy," the sergeant says, tapping the linen. "Procedures clear. Any enemy wounded gets processed." "We can't be harboring—" "He's our patient," Edward replies, voice even and low, the diary heavy in his inside coat pocket. He moves so slowly that the tent seems to slow with him, as if the lantern light holds its breath. The sergeant's jaw tightens. He lifts his chin to the MPs who shift their weight, the threat latent in the way their coats crease. "You'll hand him over," the sergeant says. "Names, ID, now." Edward does not read the roster. He does not fetch the diary. Instead, he kneels at the side of Matthias and lays a hand on the man's wrist, feeling the warmth there, the pulse steady as a small drum. Around them, bodies bustle. A nurse drops a tray with a clatter and then, after a pause, returns to her work as if nothing has happened. Helen stands beside Edward, her face a flat shield. "He received treatment here," she says simply. "We followed triage. You want names? You'll find them on our report, but this man," she nods toward Matthias, "is under our care." "Under your care does not mean under your protection," the sergeant says. He glances at the field diary in Edward's coat, citing its shape, and then at the ampules on the tray. "If he's a prisoner, that's someone else's jurisdiction." Edward lifts his eyes, and for a moment there is a hardness there that the others rarely hear. "The Geneva Convention grants medical neutrality," he says. His voice does not rise. It simply lays a fact on the table like a sterile instrument. A medic's duty is to tend the wounded without discrimination. He is a patient first. The sergeant answers with procedure and supply lines. He cites orders, the chain of command, the scarcity that justifies strict accounting. He speaks of consequences for deviation, of signatures and forms that can follow a man into custody. The MPs shift, and somewhere outside a truck door slams, the sound a punctuation that reads like possible finality. "You can argue law when we get a judge," the sergeant says, "but right now—" Right now, Edward interrupts, and the tent hushes for the force of his next motion. This man is breathing because we acted. If he leaves our care into processes that will kill him, then we have failed the work we swore to do. His hand rests on the diary in his pocket as if to anchor the claim. My oath is to the patient. I will not remove that protection. There is a tilt in the sergeant's face, not hostility so much as bewildered calculation. He gestures toward the MPs. You understand the consequences of delaying or falsifying the roster? Helen steps closer so her shoulder lightly touches Edward's. We recorded unknown, she says quietly, as if ticking a small private accounting. It was to protect a life. We did not falsify anything. We withheld an identity to prevent immediate harm. You're obstructing an investigation, one MP says. That's a charge. Edward stands, the diary in his palm now, its pages rough against his thumb. He does not hide it. He places it on the folding table, open to the page where unknown sits like a deliberate absence. He sets his watch, the silver one his father gave him, beside the diary, a small exchange of trust and time. Then he does something that shocks no one more than it does himself. He unbuttons his sleeve and offers his arm. If blood is required later to confirm status, he says, voice steady, I'll give mine. If proof is needed that he was treated here and not abandoned, I'll sign, but you will not take a man from a medic while he still breathes. You're volunteering to... The sergeant begins. I'm volunteering to be accountable, Edward says. The words are not bravado, they are a ledger entry. He rolls up his sleeve and rolls a bandage under his arm, exposing white skin patched with old scars. The medics fetch a needle. Helen finds a clean ampule and prepares a syringe with the calm motions of someone who has done this too many times to feel drama in it. The MPs look at the exchange, a medic offering blood, an officer weighing orders, nurses moving in that disciplined blur between care and crisis. A quiet forms as those present register the meaning of the gesture. Donation here is not a mere medical act. It is a declaration of responsibility. It says, I will put part of myself where the forms demand proof. It says, I will not betray the man I helped to save. Matthias watches with eyes that are searching and slow. He reaches out and curls his fingers around Edward's wrist, a gesture too raw for words. Edward squeezes in return, and in that small clasp there is an oath kept without paper. The needle goes in, blood runs into a small tube, and the act is recorded not in a ledger, but in the room's stillness. You're putting yourself at risk, Helen whispers. So is everyone who steps into these tents, Edward answers. He breathes in and says the line that will follow him. I took an oath to save the wounded. I will not let paperwork undo that. The sergeant watches the drop of blood fall into the reservoir. His face loosens in ways the others cannot read. He stamps a form, not approvingly, but perhaps with a new reluctance. The MPs remain, their posture a watchful neutrality. The diary lies between them like a small, stubborn amulet. When the convoy assembles, Edward signs the roster with his name and station, but he does not write Matthias's name into the official columns. He folds into his pocket the folded scrap with the German address, tucking it away like a small guardian. The choice is explicit and intentional, to use the apparatus of record to shield rather than to expose. As the stretcher is lifted and the convoy rolls into the gray, Matthias's eyes hold Edward's, and he tries a word that nearly breaks in the narrowness between languages. Danke, he says, and the syllable is as much a surrender as a thanks. Edward answers with a nod, and a phrase he murmurs so that only Matthias or the dying light might catch it. We are here to save lives. The syllables echo the oath he made long ago in a classroom and later in the mud. Medicine first, allegiance second. In that moment, when vehicle engines drown out the tent and the diary rests against his chest, the act of restraint, refusing to let bureaucracy decide who lives, becomes the clearest demonstration of strength he has known. A stained armband folded into a kit, an empty ampule glinting on the tray, small objects that keep the knight's choices alive. The diary sits warm against Edward's chest, a private ledger of mercy. Strength is restraint. Civilization is a choice. For more true accounts of medics and nurses who put oath above order, subscribe for the next story of mercy, Under Fire. Edward tucks the diary deeper, feeling the pages warm against his ribs as the convoy's rumble recedes into the white. Helen folds a blood-stained bandage into careful squares, eyes tired but steady. Matthias sleeps with the folded address in his palm, a quiet proof that a name can be sheltered so a life may continue. The decision hangs like a thumbprint on paper, small, stubborn, human. For more accounts where oath met mercy, subscribe for the next story.